such series as Hannibal, The Path, and the new Law & Order reboot. He's also appeared on Broadway and in films including Adam and Hysteria. Here to read a condensed version of Greg Jackson's story, The Hollow, please welcome Hugh Dancy.
Jonah Valenti had been an object of amusement to Jack and his college classmates. An awkward, intense, muscle-bound young man, the sort you could imagine crashing through a wall accidentally. He had had the dim, muddled quality of students recruited to play football at the school, who either didn't measure up academically or didn't believe they did. Valenti's claim to fame came from his having abruptly quit football during sophomore year to take up painting, a passion he had developed apparently out of the blue, and with a single-minded earnestness that embarrassed his more sophisticated classmates. When Valenti left the football team, changed his major, and began hanging out with a group of druggy slackers who loitered around the visual arts department, the school paper ran a feature on his unusual transformation, and he acquired the nickname Beaux-Arts. This got shortened to BA, and then Valenti, Valentino, the baleen whale, simply the whale, and by a different route altogether, Picasso. A year later, after spending the summer in Florence on a painting scholarship, Valenti got kicked out of school. According to rumors at the time, his expulsion had to do with drugs, but Valenti maintained among his friends that it was the school's way of punishing him for quitting football. Jack had no basis for judgment, nor did he really care. In the indolent halcyon days before graduation, Jack had thought about Valenti exactly once. He'd been lying, completely stoned, in a friend's common room, gazing up at the crown mouldings, when he realized that people called Valenti the whale, not simply because of the association pattern in certain words, but in reference to the story of Jonah. When this insight lit up within him, it seemed to glow for a minute with a profound and inarticulable meaning. Then he forgot it. And he probably would have forgotten Valenti too, if years later he hadn't moved to the rural area where, according to their mutual friend Daniel, Valenti lived at home with his mother. Jack had moved there with Sophie. Sophie's choice, he jokingly told people. Really, they had both made the choice. But then, shortly after buying the house and leaving the city, he had, in quick succession, lost his new job and lost Sophie. Sometimes Sophie called herself a journalist, but that wasn't quite right. She wrote, although she picked up magazine assignments infrequently and had trouble finishing pieces. She bit off more than she could chew, spent months diving deeply into projects, then found herself paralyzed, unable to write a word. Jack had long ago stopped giving her advice. He simply assumed that he would earn the money and she would figure out how she wanted to spend her time. And either way, they would have kids and a home, a garden, friends, vacations, and so on. Buying the house had taken the better part of a year. Then, in the space of 4 weeks, everything had collapsed. Sophie said that her feelings for him hadn't changed, but she now understood that something was wrong with the life they had laid out before them, and if she didn't get out now, she never would. Jack pointed out that their new life had hardly begun, but she was unshakable. I know myself. Once I settle in, once we have a kid and the rest, I'll never leave. Please. She touched his forearm, and he didn't argue. Better to give people space, he thought. Either they came back to you, or they disappeared into their own confusion and misery. The house was in Trevi, a small hamlet upriver from the city, out past the suburbs, picturesque and quaint, with Bradford pear trees all along the main street, which in spring so filled the roadway with petals that it resembled a snow scene. A water tower bearing the town's name and stilted up on arachnid legs, with water stains rusting its grey-blue paint, dwarfed the two-story houses and brick storefronts and shops. A local wag had christened this Travy Fountain. Travy sat on the train line north of the city and laid claim to the only stop for 20 miles in either direction, and naturally this brought a certain wealth and cosmopolitanism you did not find everywhere in the region, and certainly not in Rock Basin, where Jonah Valenti lived with his mother. Initially, Jack had planned to take the train to work. He'd been at Tabor Investments only a short time when he was fired. Before that, he'd spent half a decade in the DA's office and seemed in line for a political career, but he had burned out on that life, or that's what he told people. And in anticipation of starting a family, he signed on for what he believed would be a cushier position all round. Perhaps his new employer didn't agree with this interpretation of his job, because as soon as he gave his bosses a chance, by making an impolitic remark on a business news show, they had wasted little time firing him. No, they had dangled the threat. He could have fought to stay, but instead, haughty and superior, he had called their bluff and forced them to follow through. The house was an early 19th century farmhouse, fixed up and expanded over the years, painted charcoal following the new style, a colour like smoke against the pitch-dark sky. It had clapboard siding and a metal roof, a mostly private small field with an old stone wall and a falling down chicken coop. Jack, who had been so invested in settling in, furnishing, repainting, talking to contractors and arborists about what to do with the chicken coop, the silver maples, the pin oaks, found himself overcome with apathy. He could hardly bring himself to wash the dishes or take out the trash. Not long before, he'd been at Dynamo, on the phone with lawyers and water treatment specialists. He'd learned about ground wells and leach fields, sump pumps, pipe fittings, the lifespan of roofing shingles, and septic tank baffles. Baffles. He liked that. That just about said it. Daniel, Jack's friend from school, said that Jack's state of mind made a lot of fucking sense. Jesus, considering everything, get drunk, get laid, he said. The French would go out whoring. Daniel was a successful magazine writer, and someone Sophie often turned to for professional advice. Any word from Sophie? Jack asked. Soph, she's all right. She's staying at her parents', but I guess you know that. Daniel laughed suddenly. The last time I saw her, she was hanging out in bars, writing in a notebook, waiting for guys to text her. Jack responded stoically. What guys? Dates? I don't know. I think she was writing a book about contemporary dating or dating apps, something like that. I see. So she's the one out whoring, Jack said. Yeah, you're the only one not having any fun. Jack could picture her sitting at the bar, her black hair unfurling about her face as she bent over her journal, pensive and daydreaming. It surprised him to find this thought poignant, rather than upsetting. Still, when he reached her on the phone, he said, "So I hear you've been out whoring." She didn't laugh at this, but made a noise that suggested fatigue or annoyance. What did Daniel tell you? Jack gave an inaccurate, largely imaginative account of the conversation. When he finished, Sophie was quiet for a moment and then said, "I don't want to get in the habit of explaining myself to you, so I guess I'm not going to. If it's freedom, it has to feel like freedom," he suggested. Something like that. Later, with nothing to do, he telephoned Valenti. Holy shit! Jack Francis! Boy, was it Valenti. That same deep, excitable voice. Dude, am I glad you called, Valenti said. My mom is driving me crazy. It was Valenti who noticed the hollow. This was not during his first visit, which he and Jack spent getting very drunk. Jack told him about Sophie, the DA's office, and his brief foray into the private sector. Mostly, though, he listened to Valenti talk about the years he had spent trying to get his artistic career off the ground, keeping body and soul together on part-time work. Valenti had been employed by a house painting crew, but something had happened, and now he coached women's rugby at a Catholic school across the river. They discussed college, of course, and Jack was taken aback to find that their memories of this time did not align. He shouldn't have been surprised by this. Valenti had many strange notions, but it was vaguely unnerving to see that two people could live through the same experience and understand it so differently. Jack said that at first he found everyone at college interesting, but they'd all turned out to be dull and conventional, and he increasingly saw himself as dull and conventional too. Valenti disagreed. He thought that their classmates had been deeply weird and had clung to the idea that they were dull and conventional to keep from sliding off the face of the earth. He and Valenti remember the aftermath of Jonah's expulsion differently as well. Valenti seemed to believe that some sort of popular movement had arisen to reinstate him. Jack recalled nothing of the sort. He remembered jokes about Valenti and the sense, if not the outright suggestion, that it was just as well what had happened, since there was clearly something off about their former classmate. Jack and Valenti were sitting outside under a pergola heavy with potato vine and clematis. Jack had built a fire in the fire pit, and the wood crackled and sparked, dashing the flowers and vines in a shifting light. Valenti said that he was rereading his favorite biography of Van Gogh, and that the artist, who claimed to find the darkness more colorful and vivid than the day, had painted at night with lighted candles in the brim of his straw hat. A great fire burns in me, but no one stops to warm himself, he recited. They pass by and see only the wisps of smoke. Valenti leaned back and tilted his head to the sky. The light and shadow accentuated the bones and hollows of his face. He told Jack he was saving up for a summer program in France, a painting course. Not the usual bullshit, he said. You studied with some real masters, and they took you to all the famous spots, Auvers, Arles, Saint-Remy. But it was expensive, and he couldn't save enough unless he lived with his mom. Was he showing work? Jack wanted to know. Well, there was a cafe in Rock Basin, Valenti said. It wasn't much, but it had a little gallery and he had some work up there. He told Jack that Van Gogh's first public exhibition had been in the window of an art supplier, a man he owed money to in The Hague. Van Gogh talked the guy into putting up a few of his paintings. If they sold, he said he'd use the money to pay off the debt. Well, they didn't sell, and the dealers who saw them in the window didn't like them either. Valenti laughed. It just shows you, he said, smiling at nothing but the dark. Everyone has to start somewhere. Dude, what's in the middle of your house? This was how Valenti greeted Jack on his third visit. Jack handed him a beer and retrieved another from the fridge. What do you mean, the middle? Valenti explained that he'd awoken in the night with a strange intuition that there was something wrong with Jack's house. I keep walking around it in my head, and then I realize there's an area that's not part of any room. Jack didn't understand, and Valenti led him to the closed-off section of the house, demonstrating how, approaching it from any of the 6 adjoining rooms, you wouldn't notice anything odd and might even confuse it for part of the stair column. It was smaller than a room, and could, he conjectured, be a sealed-in linen closet or pantry, or perhaps a disused chimney shaft, though when they walked above and below the area on the 2nd floor and in the basement, no vertical element carried through. Valenti asked Jack for a tape measure and a pen and paper, and set about sketching a rough floor plan. He drew with surprising efficiency and ease. The low sun barreled through the west-facing windows, penetrating the colored glass jars along the windowsill and painting forms like watercolor blotches on the wall. Valenti guessed that the sealed off area wasn't much bigger than 3 feet by 6. To know more, he'd have to go through the wall. But Jack had just finished repainting the walls, so there was a hollow. So what? They moved out into the warm, silken dusk. A golden light crested the hill, and Valenti gazed into the setting sun. When you said moving here was Sophie's Choice, were you quoting that movie? Yes. It's a book, Jack said, or it was a book first, about the Holocaust. So they say. Valenti squinted in perplexity. What does the Holocaust have to do with moving here?